We stand at the threshold of history, where the dust of millennia clings to the remnants of the first great cities. We are often taught to measure the power of the ancient world in bronze, in the monumental scale of its architecture, and in the unquestioned authority of its warrior kings. We picture the shadow of the ziggurat soaring over the Mesopotamian plain, believing that divine mandate and military might were the sole forces capable of forging empires from scattered villages. This narrative, however, compelling, misses the quiet, bureaucratic engine that truly powered civilization's infancy. Beneath the veneer of spectacular display and divine decree, the true scaffolding of the first large-scale states was an innovation far more subtle, yet infinitely more powerful than any sword: the invention of economic coordination. This journey takes us not through battlefields, but into granaries, not into royal palaces, but into the scribal schools where the architecture of obligation was first mapped out. Long before the first recognized coin jingled in a market stall, an invisible force was standardizing human relationships and scaling trust from the tribal unit to the sprawling state. This force was money, redefined, not as currency, but as a revolutionary system of debt, accounting, and mobilization. In the scorched ruins of Sumerian cities like Uruk and Lagash, archaeologists have uncovered not just epic poems and royal inscriptions, but millions of small, baked clay artifacts. These humble tablets, covered in the wedge-shaped script of cuneiform, are the ledgers of antiquity. They meticulously record grain allocations, labor quotas, interest payments, and complex networks of indebtedness. These records are the true blueprint of empire. They reveal how rulers transformed the unpredictable bounty of the harvest into predictable political power, allowing them to calculate the value of a farmer's future potential and mobilize that wealth today. The transition from subsistence farming to centralized statehood demanded a mechanism to feed non-productive specialists, the priests, the soldiers, the engineers, and the scribes themselves, and to synchronize the labor of thousands for massive public works, particularly the complex irrigation systems essential for survival in the river valleys. This required a level of abstraction previously unimaginable. How do you pay 1,000 workers digging a canal miles away? Not with barter, which is clumsy and localized, but with a universal unit of account, standardized barley, or a fixed weight of silver, a promise of future value guaranteed by the state. This system was the foundation upon which the Akkadian Empire and later the highly centralized bureaucracy of Ur III were constructed. It allowed for the synchronization of labor, the financing of long-distance trade, and the projection of authority across vast, previously unmanageable distances. The question we pursue is profound. How did a simple accounting entry become the most effective political weapon of the ancient world? We trace the line from a notation written in wet clay 4,000 years ago to the global credit networks that define our current reality. The story of the first empires is not just a tale of conquest, it is the story of the first financial revolution, demonstrating that authority was built not on brute force alone, but on the revolutionary architecture of ledgers and standardized debt. The ability to create credit where none existed before, to quantify debt, and to enforce repayment through centralized religious and political authority, transformed the nature of power itself. It allowed rulers to command resources far beyond their immediate physical grasp, effectively turning anticipated harvests into present-day capital. This economic sophistication was the true engine of expansion, enabling the scale and complexity that define the very concept of civilization. We must now turn our attention to the physical reality that necessitated this financial innovation, examining the challenging landscapes that forced these early societies to become masters of resource management and bureaucratic control. The birthplace of this financial revolution was the narrow, fertile strip between the Tigris and Euphrates, a land of paradoxes. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, was incredibly rich in agricultural potential, yet desperately poor in almost everything else. It possessed no timber for construction, no metal ores for tools or weapons, and no large stone deposits for monumental building. This scarcity, coupled with the annual, often violent flooding cycle of the rivers, created a fundamental geopolitical tension. Survival demanded absolute coordination and complex resource management. The geography dictated the economy. The rivers were both life-givers and tyrants. Harnessing their energy required massive intercity irrigation networks, canals, dikes, and reservoirs that demanded synchronized labor across entire regions. No single village could manage this infrastructure alone. The cost of failure was famine and societal collapse. This necessity for cooperation on a grand scale provided the initial impetus for centralized authority. The ruler, often framed as the steward of the gods, became the ultimate manager of the water system, and by extension, the manager of the grain, the primary unit of value. Grain, specifically barley, became the standard currency of account because it was the most essential and measurable commodity produced by the land. It was heavy, perishable, and difficult to transport, which meant it had to be stored centrally, often in temple complexes and royal granaries. These granaries were the world's first banks, functioning not by holding metal, but by issuing receipts, the clay tablets, against stored deposits. The physical reality of the grain, its bulk and its perishability, forced the development of abstract written accounting. Rulers did not move mountains of barley to pay their soldiers. They issued a slip of clay, a promise redeemable at a designated depot, thereby transforming a perishable commodity into fungible liquid value. The lack of local resources also spurred the necessity for long-distance trade, extending the economic reach of the Mesopotamian cities far into Anatolia, the Levant, and the Persian Gulf. To finance these high-risk expeditions, trading grain and textiles for copper, tin, and cedar, required sophisticated credit networks. Merchants were often financed by temple or royal capital, operating on complex loan agreements that specified interest rates, collateral, and repayment schedules, all meticulously documented on clay. Thus, the physical geography of scarcity and the logistical demands of irrigation and trade were the crucible in which formalized debt, interest, and centralized accounting, the true components of ancient money, were forged, making economic innovation a direct response to the harsh realities of the land. From the foundational need for centralized resource management emerged a profound cultural system rooted in meticulous record-keeping and codified obligation. The culture of the early Mesopotamian empires was, at its heart, a culture of administration. The scribe, the master of the cuneiform stylus, and the keeper of the ledger, held a position of prestige almost equal to the military general or the high priest. Literacy was not primarily for poetry or theology, but for the practical execution of state finance. The entire societal structure was designed to ensure the continuity of the economic machine. The laws themselves reflected this economic primacy. The Code of Hammurabi, while famous for its eye for an eye provisions, is fundamentally an economic document, dedicating the vast majority of its clauses to regulating contracts, debt, interest rates, collateral, and labor relationships. It was a manual to maintain financial stability and prevent the debt spirals that could destabilize the entire agricultural base. This legal framework institutionalized the concept of debt as a moral and political obligation, reinforcing the power of the central authority that guaranteed and enforced the contracts. Religion, too, was inextricably linked to the economy. The temple was not merely a place of worship. It was the largest landholder, the primary employer, and the most stable repository of wealth, the original central bank. Priests oversaw the collection of tithes, the administration of stored grain, and the extension of credit, blurring the lines. The history of these first empires is the story of how economic innovation drove political expansion, a powerful narrative best exemplified by the rise and collapse of the three great dynasties, Akkad, Ur-III, and Babylon. The Akkadian Empire, under Sargon, was the first to unify the fractious city-states of Mesopotamia under a single imperial administration around 2350 BCE. Sargon's genius was not just military, it was logistical. He needed to feed permanent, centrally controlled armies and project uniform authority over vast territory. This required standardizing the unit of account and ensuring that the royal treasury, not local temples, controlled the flow of goods and credit. The true peak of this administrative state, however, was the Ur-III dynasty, 2112 to 2004 BCE. This period saw the creation of the most sophisticated bureaucratic machine the world had yet known. Historians have recovered tens of thousands of Ur-III tablets, revealing a state where virtually every economic transaction was recorded and centrally managed. The government calculated labor inputs, optimized agricultural output, and even regulated the size of the national sheep herd. This hyper-centralized system, financed entirely through debt, taxation, and state-administered credit, allowed Ur-III to command unparalleled resources, building massive public works and maintaining absolute regional hegemony. The identity of the citizens within these empires shifted from local loyalty to an identity predicated on their relationship to the central economic structure. They were defined by their obligations as taxpayers, debtors, or recipients of royal rations. The concept of citizenship was inseparable from the economic contract with the state. This standardization of identity, enforced by the ubiquitous presence of the royal scribe and the state ledger, created a powerful unified national consciousness focused on resource generation and stability. However, this reliance on centralized accounting carried the seeds of its own destruction. The system was inherently fragile, designed for efficiency but vulnerable to external shocks. The collapse of Ur-III was not a sudden military defeat, but a prolonged financial and ecological crisis. Climate change led to reduced river flow, rendering the complex irrigation system less effective. Crop yields dropped, but the centralized bureaucracy, rigid and slow to adapt, continued to demand the same quotas and enforce the same debt schedules. The state's ability to finance its operations evaporated, leading to mass debt defaults, internal rebellions, and the eventual disintegration of the hyper-centralized structure, proving that when the financial ledger fails, the political empire soon follows. Today, the legacy of these ancient financial systems permeates our global economy, even as the specific realities of life in the modern Middle East present a complex tapestry of challenges and achievements. The contemporary reality is often viewed through the lens of conflict, resource politics, and religious fundamentalism, obscuring the deep historical layers of administrative genius that defined the region for millennia. The modern challenges faced by nations built on the same ancient landscapes, Iraq in particular, often echo the vulnerabilities of their imperial predecessors. Dependence on a single volatile resource, oil instead of grain, and the need for massive, centralized infrastructure management remain defining features. Yet the current struggle is often the fight for financial stability and bureaucratic integrity in the face of ongoing geopolitical friction. The ancient struggle to standardize value and enforce contracts, which was the triumph of Ur III, remains a critical hurdle for modern governance. Globally, the perception of these lands is often dominated by media narratives of instability, leading to a profound misunderstanding of the inherent resilience and deep intellectual heritage of the people. While ancient Sumerians struggled with debt bondage due to famine, modern citizens struggle with economic volatility driven by global markets and political corruption. The fundamental tension, how to manage scarce resources and enforce universal economic rules, persists. The greatest contemporary achievement, often overlooked, is the continued effort to reclaim and understand this vast historical archive. Scholars laboring over cuneiform tablets are not simply studying dead history, they are uncovering the very foundations of economic thought, the first interest rates, the first complex loans, the first systematic taxation. These discoveries challenge the Western-centric view that financial sophistication began with Greek coins or Italian city-states. They reveal that the capacity for complex financial modeling and bureaucratic control was a foundational element of the first human civilizations, a reality that profoundly shapes how the region views its own historical power and its current struggles for autonomy and stability in a globalized world. We began by seeking the true engine of ancient power, and we found it not in the roar of the chariot, but in the quiet scratch of the stylus upon wet clay. The empires of Mesopotamia teach us a fundamental truth. Authority is often less about brute force and more about the elegant and invisible architecture of finance. They built their world on ledgers, demonstrating the ability to quantify, to promise, and to enforce debt is the ultimate tool for mobilizing human potential on a grand scale. This journey through the world's first financial revolution should leave us with a profound realization. The anxieties that define our modern economy, the fear of systemic risk, the reliance on credit, the need for centralized financial institutions, and the vulnerability of complex systems to external shock are not modern inventions. They are the human condition, first articulated and managed 4,000 years ago. The clay tablets of Sumer are not relics, they are mirrors reflecting the enduring challenges of human cooperation and statecraft. By uncovering how these ancient rulers managed risk, financed innovation, and ultimately succumbed to the fragility inherent in their debt-based systems, we gain crucial insight into the economic forces that continue to shape our world. We are invited to look beyond the spectacle of monuments and military power and to appreciate the quiet genius of the scribes who invented the very concept of systematic accounting. They standardized time, measured the stars, and codified human obligation, leaving behind a legacy that confirms that the capacity for abstraction, for turning a perishable bushel of grain into an enduring promise of value, is the true hallmark of civilization. Let this history awaken in us a renewed respect for the foundational power of economic thought, and a greater understanding of how the promises written in clay millennia ago continue to dictate the terms of our prosperity and our vulnerability today. The strict, localized accounting of the grain economy, indispensable though it was for managing state resources, eventually proved too cumbersome for the expanding ambitions of the early empires. Consequently, a crucial evolution occurred: the widespread adoption of silver, measured in the standardized unit of the shekel, as the universal medium of exchange. Silver was not grown or harvested. It was mined, transported, and valued precisely for its scarcity and non-perishability. This marked a profound departure from the bulky, perishable barley note. The metal, typically circulated as uncoined ingots, coils, or rings, became the ultimate abstraction of value. It was wealth distilled, compact, and inherently portable. This portability unlocked trade routes previously hampered by the logistical nightmare of moving bulk commodities, allowing the imperial financial reach to extend far beyond the immediate floodplains of the rivers into the resource-rich mountains and distant seas. This shift fundamentally altered the social dynamics of commerce. When value was represented by a receipt for state-held grain, the transaction relied on the explicit, localized trust in the ruling temple or palace bureaucracy. Conversely, silver transactions introduced an element of impersonal trust, a necessary component for true market expansion. The shekel of silver held its value regardless of whether the buyer was a known citizen or a foreign merchant arriving from the distant highlands. This reliance on the metal's inherent, accepted value standardized trust between strangers, enabling the formation of extensive, private merchant networks that operated parallel to the state's agricultural financing. The Assyrian trade colonies, for instance, thrived not on military conquest, but on the sophisticated extension of credit using silver as collateral, thereby demonstrating a new, geographically unbounded form of economic power that relied on universal acceptance rather than localized state decree. This ancient history is not merely a record of forgotten civilizations. It is the blueprint of our modern world. We still operate under the fundamental assumptions established by those scribes. Our global economy, reliant on digital ledgers, complex derivatives, and vast networks of credit, is simply the most sophisticated iteration of the Mesopotamian prototype. The anxieties that grip us today, the fear of systemic risk, the moral weight of unpayable debt, the concentration of financial power, are direct echoes of the challenges faced by Hammurabi's administrators. The medium has changed from clay to code, but the ghost in the machine remains the same: the delicate equilibrium between human promise and material reality. The true practice begins now, as we recognize that to understand the modern world, we must understand its most ancient operating system. To study the cuneiform tablets is to gain insight into the very nature of human authority, to see that power is not a force, but a calculation, not a display, but a meticulously maintained account. We are invited to look past the superficial spectacle of contemporary politics and commerce, and instead focus on the silent, pervasive mechanisms of financial obligation that dictate global destiny. The empires taught us that stability is an illusion maintained by diligent bookkeeping. Our ultimate reflection must be this: every debt we carry, every transaction we make, and every financial institution we trust is part of a continuing experiment launched on the scorched earth between two rivers, proving that the most enduring structures of civilization are not those built of stone, but those built entirely of promises.